There are about 600 people packed into that nightclub, and not one of them is breathing. The year is 1958. The room smells like cigarette smoke and expensive perfume, and a kind of ambition that only New York City can manufacture. The glasses on the tables are sweating. The band has just hit a chord that hangs in the air like a question nobody wants to answer. And right there, at a small table no more than 4 feet from the microphone, sits the greatest jazz singer who ever lived. A woman who has made grown men weep with a single-held note. A woman whose voice the critics have compared to a force of nature. A woman who has been called, without exaggeration, the First Lady of Song. And she has just covered both of her ears with her hands. Her eyes are squeezed shut. Her shoulders are raised in mock agony. And the crowd is losing their minds. What you need to understand is that the man standing at that microphone, tall, effortlessly handsome, a glass of something amber-colored resting on top of the piano behind him like it was born there, is not just any performer. He is Dean Martin. And in 1958, Dean Martin is not merely famous. He is a living embodiment of a certain kind of American cool that the country has never seen before and will never quite see again. He is the man who made singing look like the easiest thing in the world. He is the man Frank Sinatra called his idol. He is the man who once walked onto a stage so relaxed that the audience felt their own blood pressure drop just from watching him. And tonight, something extraordinary is about to happen. Something that will ripple outward from the smoke-filled room, travel across newspaper columns and radio broadcasts and dinner table conversations, and eventually force an entire nation to confront something it had been very carefully, very deliberately, refusing to look at. But before we get there, and we will get there, every single detail of what happened that night and what it meant, you need to understand how these two people ended up in the same room. Because the story of that moment does not begin in 1958. It begins much, much earlier. And it begins not in glamour, but in pain. Ella Jane Fitzgerald was born on April 25, 1917, in Newport News, Virginia. Her mother, Temperance, worked in a laundry. Her father, William, was not around. What that means for a black girl in Virginia in 1917, in a country where the wounds of the Civil War are still raw and Jim Crow has written its cruelty into every law and custom and sign above every water fountain. That is something that requires a moment of stillness to truly absorb. The America that Ella was born into did not believe that she deserved a future. It had said so plainly in legislation and in violence. Her mother moved the family to Yonkers, New York, and took up with a man named Joseph Da Silva. They had a daughter together, Ella's half-sister Frances. For a while, there was something like stability. There was a neighborhood. There was school. There was, above all, music. Ella would stand on street corners and listen to records playing from open windows. She would absorb rhythms the way other children absorbed sunlight. Her teachers noticed it. Her friends noticed it. But Ella herself could not yet see the scale of what she was carrying inside her. Then her mother died. Ella was 15 years old. What follows is a chapter of her life that her biographers have treated with great care, because it is a chapter full of shadows. She went to live with her aunt. She fell behind in school. She drifted. She got involved with people she should not have been involved with. The city of New York, which can be a warm and generous place, can also be a machine that grinds young girls down into nothing. And in the early 1930s, it was trying very hard to do exactly that to Ella Fitzgerald. She was arrested. She was sent to a reformatory, the Colored Orphan Asylum, and then the New York Training School for Girls in Hudson. New York, a place where the conditions were, by all accounts, brutal. She was beaten. She was cold. She was hungry. She was 15, then 16, and the world seemed to have decided that whatever she was meant to become, it was to do everything in its power to prevent it. She escaped. That is the only word for it. She ran. And she found herself in Harlem, sleeping where she could, surviving on whatever came her way. And one night in November 1934, she walked into the Apollo Theater, not to perform, but because the amateur night contest was offering a cash prize, and she desperately needed money. She had signed up to dance. That was the plan. But when she got to wings and saw the dancers who were ahead of her, something shifted. They were extraordinary. She was not a dancer, not like that. And when her name was called and she walked out into that spotlight, the audience looked at this thin, poorly dressed, slightly awkward teenager, and they were not impressed. The Apollo crowd was famously brutal. They had a man whose only job was to drag bad performers off the stage with a hook. But then Ella opened her mouth. The story of what happened in the next 3 minutes has been told so many times that it has taken on the quality of myth. But the people who were there that night were unanimous. The laughter stopped. The shuffling stopped. The low rumble of an impatient crowd went completely, utterly silent. And then, when she finished, the room erupted in a way that the Apollo's manager, Ralph Cooper, would later say he had never heard before and never heard again. She won first prize, and she walked back out into the Harlem night with $25 and something else, something she couldn't yet name, but that was going to change everything. Now here's where the story takes one of its first unexpected turns, because winning at the Apollo did not immediately transform Ella Fitzgerald's life. The transformation was slower, harder, and more complicated than that. She was picked up by bandleader Chick Webb, who was himself a remarkable figure. A black man with severe spinal tuberculosis that had left him with a hunchback, who sat behind his drum kit like a general commanding an army, and whose band at the Savoy Ballroom was a heartbeat of Harlem. Webb was skeptical at first. He looked at this girl, still rough around the edges, still carrying the marks of everything she'd survived, and he was not sure, but he gave her a chance. And Ella repaid that chance with everything she had. By the late 1930s, Ella Fitzgerald was the most popular female jazz singer in America. She was recording hits. She was touring. She was on the radio. She was, by any reasonable measure, a star. But here's the thing that the music industry of the 1930s and 1940s wanted everyone to understand without ever quite saying it directly. There were different categories of star. There were stars who got to play the Savoy Ballroom and the Apollo Theater. And there were stars who got to play the Copacabana, the Macambo, the Store Club. And those two categories in that America did not overlap. The line between them was not drawn by talent. It was not drawn by popularity. It was drawn by race. And it was enforced with a quiet, devastating efficiency that the people on the wrong side had understood completely and the people on the right side had preferred not to think about. Ella Fitzgerald knew exactly which side of the line she was on. She knew it every time she toured the South and couldn't eat in the restaurants where her white bandmates ate. She knew it every time she had to sleep in a private home because the hotels wouldn't take her. She knew it in 1955 when she was arrested at the Houston airport for shooting craps in the back room, a charge so transparently manufactured that it had to be dropped, but not before the humiliation was complete. She knew it every time she stood outside one of those gleaming white tablecloth supper clubs and understood that her voice, the most celebrated voice in American music, was not welcome inside. And this is where Dean Martin's story intersects with hers, and where this whole thing stops being just a story about two singers and starts being something much, much larger. Dino Paul Crocetti was born on June 7th, 1917, which means he and Ella Fitzgerald were born within 6 weeks of each other. In the same year, in a country that had already decided their lives would be completely different. He was born in Steubenville, Ohio, to Italian immigrant parents, in a neighborhood where being Italian meant something specific and not always pleasant. Italian Americans in the 1910s and 1920s occupied a complicated position in the American racial hierarchy. They were white technically, but they were not quite right, not quite acceptable, not quite the kind of people the country's established power structure was prepared to fully embrace. Dino dropped out of school at 16. He worked in a steel mill. He boxed professionally. He bootlegged liquor for a local gangster named Doc Stocker. He dealt cards at an illegal casino. He had his nose broken so many times in the boxing ring that he needed surgery to be able to breathe properly. He was, by every conventional measure, going nowhere, but he could sing. God, could he sing. He had this quality, and it is almost impossible to describe to someone who hasn't heard it, where his voice seemed to carry with it an absolute lack of anxiety. Other singers worked. You could hear them working. Dean Martin sounded like he had simply decided to open his mouth and let music fall out, the way a man might decide to lean against a wall or light a cigarette. The effortlessness was not an affectation. It was, those who knew him insisted, simply who he was. He genuinely did not seem to find life that difficult, which is not to say his rise was easy. It wasn't. He spent years on the small club circuit, getting nowhere. Playing rooms with a bartender was louder than the applause. He changed his name from Dino Crocetti to Dean Martin. He got a nose job. He polished the rough Steubenville edges into something that played better in the spotlight. And then, in 1946, he met a skinny kid from Hoboken, New Jersey, named Jerry Lewis, and the world changed. The Martin and Lewis partnership was one of the most explosive, complicated, and ultimately heartbreaking collaborations in American entertainment history, and it deserves its own documentary. But for our purposes, what matters is that it made Dean Martin a household name. By the early 1950s, Martin and Lewis were the biggest act in the country. Movies, television, nightclubs, they were everywhere. And when the partnership ended in 1956, ended so badly, so painfully, that the two men would not speak for over a decade, the industry held its breath and waited to see if Dean Martin would survive. He did more than survive. He became something else entirely, something cooler and somehow more permanent. He became the Dean Martin who would stand with Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. and Peter Lawford and Joey Bishop in a loose confederation of talent and mutual admiration that the press would call the Rat Pack, though the members themselves hated the name. He became the Dean Martin who headlined in Las Vegas, who made album after album of quietly devastating music, who radiated such complete and total ease with himself that audiences found it almost physically comforting just to be in his presence. But here's what almost nobody talked about in those years. Here is what the gossip columns and the fan magazines and the television variety shows carefully, deliberately avoided. The world that Dean Martin occupied, the gleaming, high-rolling, late-night world of Las Vegas and the Hollywood Hills, and the best tables at the best restaurants. That world was built on a foundation of exclusion, and the most talented performers in America were being kept out of it. The Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, where the Rat Pack performed, where Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra commanded audiences of thousands, where the money flowed and the lights blazed. That hotel had a policy. Black performers could sing on the stage. Black performers could entertain the white crowds. But black performers could not stay in the hotel. They could not eat in the casino's restaurants. They could not gamble at the tables. They came in through the back, they performed, and they left. Sammy Davis Jr., who was one of the most gifted entertainers who ever lived, who had given everything to this world and been embraced by it in ways that were supposed to mean something. Sammy Davis Jr. slept in a boarding house on the other side of town, while his partners slept in a hotel where they all performed together. And Ella Fitzgerald, the first lady of song, could not get booked at the Macambo. The Macambo was the nightclub in Hollywood. It was a room that launched careers, that consecrated stardom, that transformed merely famous singers into legends. It sat on Sunset Boulevard, and it glittered with everything that American success was supposed to look like. It had a waiting list. It turned people away. And its owner, a man named Charlie Morrison, had decided that Ella Fitzgerald was not right for his clientele. He didn't say it was about race. He said it was about what the Macambo audience wanted. He said it was about the room's image. He said a lot of things that were, when you stripped them back, a single thing, and then a woman named Marilyn Monroe made a phone call. This is the part of the story that most people know, because it became one of those rare moments where a famous person did something genuinely, uncomplicatedly good and let the record show it. Marilyn Monroe called Charlie Morrison, and she told him that if he booked Ella Fitzgerald, she would come to every single show and sit in the front row. And Marilyn Monroe in 1954 was not merely famous. She was the most photographed woman on earth. Where Marilyn Monroe sat was where the cameras were. Where the cameras were was where the world looked. Charlie Morrison booked Ella Fitzgerald. She played the Macambo for 2 weeks in March of 1955. Every night, Marilyn Monroe sat in the front row. Every night, the press photographers were there. Every night, the crowd was full. And Ella Fitzgerald was, as she had always been, as she had been since that November night at the Apollo 2 decades earlier, magnificent. But here is what the newspapers and the photographers and the publicists did not linger on, because it would have complicated the feel-good story they wanted to tell. Marilyn Monroe should not have had to make that phone call. The fact that she did, the fact that it took a white movie star social capital to open a door that talent alone should have opened years before, that was not a triumph. It was an indictment. It was a system working exactly as it was designed to work, just this once producing a less catastrophically unjust outcome. And Ella Fitzgerald knew the difference. She was grateful to Marilyn Monroe. She said so publicly, repeatedly, for the rest of her life. But she was not confused about what it meant. Now we are getting closer to that night in 1958. That room, those 600 people holding their breath. But we need one more thread, because the image of Ella covering her ears is not just a charming photograph of two entertainers having fun. It is a document of something specific and important that was happening in American culture at exactly that moment. By 1958, the country was beginning, slowly and with enormous resistance, to crack. The Supreme Court had handed down Brown versus Board of Education 4 years earlier. Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat 3 years earlier. Martin Luther King Jr. was emerging as a voice of a movement that was demanding, with extraordinary courage and discipline, that America live up to its own stated values. The civil rights movement was not a distant rumble anymore. It was a roar. It was in the streets of Montgomery and Little Rock. It was in the faces of the children trying to walk into schools while crowds screamed at them. It was in the news every single day. And into this America, the entertainment industry was being forced, sometimes willingly, more often not, to ask itself some questions about the world it had built. The nightclub circuit, the television variety shows, the Hollywood studios. They had built their success on a system of segregation that was so thoroughly normalized that most of the people inside it genuinely could not see it. They were not all monsters. Many of them were, in their private lives, decent people who would have been horrified to think of themselves as complicit in something unjust. But the system did not require them to be monsters. It just required them to keep doing what they'd always done, booking who they'd always booked, and not asking why the lineups always looked a certain way. Dean Martin was not a political man. He did not write manifestos or give speeches. He was not, by temperament, someone who sought out confrontation or controversy. He liked his golf and his scotch and his family and his friends, and he approached life with a philosophical ease that could look to the uncharitable eye like indifference. But there are moments in a life when a person's true character reveals itself not in what they say, but in what they do without thinking about it, without calculating consequences, simply because some deep internal compass swings toward true north whether you want it to or not. The nightclub in 1958 is one of those moments. The details of exactly what venue this was and exactly what occasion brought these two people together have been described differently by different sources over the years, and the specificity of the historical record has some gaps, as it always does when we're talking about after-hour spaces and entertainment industry gatherings in mid-century America, where things happened that people were not always in a hurry to document. What we know clearly is that Dean Martin and Ella Fitzgerald were in the same room, that there was a microphone, that Dean Martin was performing, and that what he did next was noticed by everyone present in a way that carried weight. Dean Martin walked over to Ella Fitzgerald's table while he was singing. This was not unusual for Dean Martin. He was the kind of performer who moved through a room like he owned it, who used the whole space, who treated the audience not as a passive mass to be performed at, but as a collection of individuals to be charmed one at a time. He had been doing this his entire career. He was extraordinarily good at it. But the song he chose, and the way he directed it at Ella Fitzgerald, and the way the room read what he was doing, that was something else. He sang directly to her, not past her, not in her general direction, directly to her, with that particular quality of attention that Dean Martin had when he was being serious underneath the joke, which was almost always, he was serenading the greatest singer in the world. He was in a room full of people who understood the entertainment industry's hierarchies perfectly, placing himself in the position of the supplicant, the admirer, the one asking for approval. He was inverting the power dynamic in a way that everyone in the room understood instantly. And Ella Fitzgerald covered her ears and squeezed her eyes shut and laughed. And the laugh was real, and the mock agony was real, and the joy in the room was real. But underneath all of it, if you were paying attention, was something more serious. Because what Dean Martin was doing, publicly, unambiguously, in front of 600 witnesses, was refusing to participate in the fiction that Ella Fitzgerald was anything less than the greatest singer alive. He was not just complimenting her. He was dismantling a hierarchy by making it ridiculous. He was saying, with music and laughter, and that particularly devastating kind of charm that only he possessed, that the world opinion of this woman's status was not his problem. The crowd's reaction was what you might expect from a crowd of people who had just had something clarified for them that they already knew, but had never quite seen stated so plainly. They erupted, not politely, not with the careful applause of people acknowledging a performance, but with something raw, something that sounded like relief. The photograph taken that night, Ella with her hands over her ears, eyes shut, Dean at the microphone beside her, the crowd blurred in joy from the background, became one of the most famous images in the history of American music. And like all great photographs, it contains more than it shows. What it does not show is what happened afterward, when the lights came up a little and the room began to breathe again, and people started telling each other what they had just witnessed. What it does not show is a conversation that Ella Fitzgerald and Dean Martin had at that table, which by all accounts lasted until well past 2 in the morning and covered subjects that neither of them talked about freely in public. What it does not show is the quiet conversations happening in the corners of the room among people whose names you would recognize, people who were in the business of deciding who got heard and who didn't, who were watching what had just happened and calculating what it might mean. Because here is what you need to understand about that moment in American entertainment history. The things Dean Martin did and did not do with his enormous social capital mattered. The Rat Pack was not just a group of entertainers. They were a power structure. They had relationships with studio heads and casino owners, and the kind of politicians whose friendship was worth more than a good review. When Frank Sinatra campaigned for John F. Kennedy, he wasn't doing it as a private citizen. He was doing it as a living symbol of a particular vision of American sophistication and success that Kennedy was trying to claim for himself. These men had leverage, and what they chose to do with that leverage, or chose not to do with it, had real consequences. Dean Martin's relationship with Ella Fitzgerald was, in this context, not a trivial social fact. It was a statement. Every time he appeared on a stage with her, every time he praised her publicly, every time he directed the full force of his considerable charm at her in a room full of people who set the terms of the entertainment industry, he was spending currency. Whether he was doing it consciously or simply doing it because it was true, because he genuinely believed she was the greatest, the effect was the same. And the effect compounded over time. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, as the civil rights movement moved from the streets into the consciousness of white America in ways that could no longer be ignored, the entertainment industry found itself caught in an impossible contradiction. It had built itself on the talent of black artists while systematically denying those artists access to the full fruits of that system. It had taken the music and sold the lifestyle and kept the money and the prestige on one side of the color line. And now the country was waking up to this, unevenly, painfully, with enormous backlash and resistance, but also with a gathering inevitability. In Las Vegas, the desegregation of the casino hotels was not achieved by legislation. It was achieved in significant part by the simple refusal of the Rat Pack to participate in a system that excluded their friend and colleague Sammy Davis Jr. Sinatra, Martin, and Davis refused to perform at venues that would not house and serve their entire group equally. This was not a grand public campaign. It was not accompanied by press releases. It was just the exercise of leverage in a particular direction, quietly and repeatedly, until the economic math became undeniable. Did Dean Martin do this because he was a civil rights activist? No, he was not. He would have laughed at the description. He did it because Sammy was his friend and the situation was obviously wrong, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. The simplicity of that motivation is in some ways more powerful than a more ideologically elaborate explanation would be, because it speaks to something that did not require special moral sophistication to understand. It just required the willingness to act on what you already knew. The same instinct that made him walk over to Ella Fitzgerald's table with a microphone. Now, here's where the story gets complicated again, because this is real history, and real history does not resolve into clean lessons without remainder. Dean Martin was not a saint. He was a man who smoked and drank and liked the company of pretty women, and spent a great deal of his life insulated from the consequences of his choices by his wealth and his fame and his talent. He could afford his principles because he was never going to pay the price that the people around him paid. Ella Fitzgerald could not eat in certain restaurants. Dean Martin could eat anywhere he wanted. The solidarity he extended was real, but it was also asymmetric in ways that it would be dishonest to ignore. And Ella Fitzgerald herself was not simply a passive recipient of other people's generosity and advocacy. She was, from the very beginning of her career to its end, a woman who fought for herself with every tool available to her. Her voice, her discipline, her refusal to accept a lesser standard for her work, her insistence on being taken seriously as an artist in a world that kept trying to put her in a smaller box. She fired managers who underestimated her. She outlasted record labels that didn't know what to do with her. She reinvented herself musically multiple times. From swing to bebop to the great American songbook recordings that are now considered among the greatest achievements in the history of recorded music. The songbook recordings, in particular, deserve a moment. Beginning in 1956 with the Cole Porter Songbook, Ella Fitzgerald embarked on a series of albums dedicated to the work of America's greatest composers: Porter, Rodgers and Hart, Duke Ellington, Harold Arlen, Jerome Kern, Irving Berlin, the Gershwins. These albums were produced by Norman Granz, who had founded Verve Records specifically to give Ella the artistic freedom she deserved. And they were, when they appeared, something close to miraculous. Critics who had dismissed Ella as a pop singer, as a jazz novelty, as a performer without interpretive depth, they ran out of words. What she was doing on those recordings was demonstrating that she understood these songs not just as melody and lyric, but as emotional architecture, as the accumulated human longing and joy and heartbreak that American popular music had been building toward for decades. She sang Gershwin as if she had been there when he wrote it. She sang Cole Porter as if the wit and melancholy in the lyrics were her own private property. She sang Irving Berlin as if the songs had been waiting their entire lives for exactly her voice. These were not recordings that an industry which thought of her as a novelty act had been prepared for. They forced a reconsideration. They forced the kind of critical establishment that had kept her at arm's length, that placed her in the jazz category as a way of not quite fully acknowledging her greatness, to confront the possibility that they had been making a category error about the most important singer of their time. And into this moment of grudging, complicated, incomplete reassessment, came that night in 1958, that room, that microphone, Dean Martin singing directly at the woman who had spent her entire life earning recognition that a different world would have handed her without asking. The photograph spread. It appeared in newspapers and magazines. It circulated through the entertainment industry in a way that images circulate in a world before social media, passed from table to table in restaurants, pinned to bulletin board in offices, discussing green rooms and dressing rooms and recording studios. And what people said about it consistently was that it captured something true, not just a moment between two entertainers. Something true about a specific place and time and the people who were navigating it, the writers who saw it, the musicians, the producers, the managers, the journalists who cover the entertainment industry. They talked about it in ways that went beyond the charming surface. They talked about what it meant that the image existed at all. They talked about what it said that Dean Martin was the one standing at the microphone. They talked about what it said that Ella was sitting at that table with that expression. Not of deference, not of gratitude, but of genuine pleasure and genuine mock exasperation. The expression of a woman who was completely at ease with her own greatness and completely delighted by this man's extravagant acknowledgement of it. Because that was the thing about the image that people kept coming back to. Ella Fitzgerald did not look like a woman being done a favor. She looked like a woman whose friend was being ridiculous in the best possible way. She looked like a woman who knew exactly who she was. In the years that followed, as the civil rights movement transformed the country, the entertainment industry underwent its own transformation. Incomplete, halting, full of backsliding and bad faith, but real nonetheless. Black performers who had been confined to certain venues and certain categories of success began to break through into the mainstream in ways that changed the landscape permanently. Motown, soul music, jazz becoming the language of the intellectual mainstream. The steady, grinding dismantling of the formal and informal barriers that had defined the industry for decades. Ella Fitzgerald lived to see it. She kept performing. She kept recording. She kept touring. The voice aged as voices do. It deepened. It acquired new textures. It lost some of its upper range. But What it never lost was a quality that had silenced the Apollo crowd in 1934 and had made Dean Martin walk over to her table with a microphone in 1958 and has made every recording she ever made worth returning to again and again. She kept performing into the 1990s, even as her health declined, even as she lost most of her eyesight to diabetic retinopathy, even as the physical cost of a lifetime of performing began to accumulate in ways that could not be argued with. She gave her final performance in 1993. She died in 1996, at the age of 78, in Beverly Hills, in the city where she had once been unable to get a booking at the Macambo without a phone call from Marilyn Monroe. Dean Martin died 6 months before her, on Christmas Day, 1995. He had been, in his final years, a man diminished by grief. His son, Dean Paul Martin, had been killed in a plane crash in 1987. By all accounts, Dean Martin never recovered. He withdrew from public life, from his friends, from the social world that had been his element for half a century. He sat in his house. He watched old westerns. He ate at a particular Italian restaurant where the staff knew him and left him alone. But what he did not do in those final years was recant anything. He did not revise his history or soften his associations or decide, in retrospect, that his instincts had been wrong. He remained who he had been, and the people who had known him through the long arc of his career, the musicians, the performers, the entertainers who had watched him move through the world with that particular combination of ease and decency, they remembered what he had been. Here is what I want you to sit with in the final minutes of this story. There is a version of American entertainment history that is told as a story of steady progress, of doors gradually opening, of talent eventually winning out, of the arc of the moral universe bending, however slowly, toward justice. And there is truth in that version. Things did change. The world that Ella Fitzgerald died in was not the world she was born into, and some of that difference was real and hard-won and permanent. But the photograph from 1958 is a document of what the change actually looked like on the ground. It looked like a woman who had spent decades fighting for recognition she had always deserved sitting at a table, while a man used the full power of his charm and his celebrity and his enormous cultural presence to make the room understand what she was worth. It looked like 600 people who knew exactly what they were witnessing and responded with something that was part laughter and part relief and part the complicated joy of seeing a truth acknowledged in public that had too long been left unsaid. It looked like Dean Martin being, in his irreducible self, someone who could not stand in front of a microphone and pretend that Ella Fitzgerald was anything other than the greatest. And it looked like Ella Fitzgerald, who had survived a reformatory and her mother's death and the years of sleeping rough in Harlem, and the decades of being kept at a distance in the success she had earned. It looked like Ella Fitzgerald receiving this tribute with her hands over her ears and her eyes squeezed shut and the most genuine laugh you have ever seen on a human face. Not because she needed it, not because it changed anything on its own about the world she was living in, but because she was a woman who had spent her entire life refusing to pretend that the world was smaller than she knew it to be. And here, in this smoky room, with this ridiculous and wonderful man singing at her table, the world was briefly, incandescently, exactly the size it should always have been. The photograph faded, as photographs do, into the background of history, into the archive of images that tell us who we were and what we were doing to each other, and occasionally, on a good night, what we were capable of choosing to be instead. But it has never stopped being true. It has never stopped documenting that moment when the music stopped making excuses, and the room held its breath, and the greatest singer in American history sat at her table and laughed with her whole body. And somewhere in the distance, in the places where music goes when the last note has faded and the last singer has left the stage, Dean Martin is still walking toward that microphone, and Ella Fitzgerald is still covering her ears, and the room is still erupting. And that particular kind of American night, imperfect, joyful, shot through with everything the country was, and everything was failing to be, and everything it might yet become, that night is still happening, over and over, every time someone who knows what it meant presses play.